Well, hello. Welcome to the first sermon to be recorded upon St. Christopher's Church in Leicester's YouTube page. We are partway through a series called True Worship, Real Church, and this is the 9th sermon in that series, and it is about being builders, about how Christians are builders. I'm sure we all know that appearances can be deceptive. We know it can be true of people, we know it can be true of situations, we know it can be true of all sorts of things. But maybe one practical way we experience this is when we have to choose a new home. A decent lick of paint, a nice set of carpets, maybe double glazed windows. These things gives us the instant impression that this is a good house. But how wrong we can be. Myself and Sarah, my wife, lived in a small one-bedroom flat when we were first married, in a set of flats that were only around 15 to 20 years old at the time. And when we came to sell the flat, it was in good condition. More thanks to Sarah than myself, I think, so that we didn't feel at all ashamed when people came to have a look around the flat. But actually, there was a big problem that was outside of me and Sarah's control. You see, although the flats were fairly new, there were already cracks coming up the outer walls. Already the structure was starting to crumble. That's not the reason we sold it, by the way, before you ask. But what it really shows is that when it comes to building, the quality of the work one day gets shown for what it is. Good building stays strong, poor building ends in disaster. We are currently facing a very difficult time, not just in this country, but across the globe. And I'm sure many a church minister has stopped to think, what should I communicate with my first online sermon? And it will be easy to abandon our preaching series and do a topical sermon on something like, why do bad things happen at all? And that is a totally valid topic for a sermon. And the Bible does speak about that subject. So maybe that's for another day soon. But when I looked at the passages that had already been chosen for St. Christopher's service today, I wanted to stick with them. Because Jesus' words in Luke chapter 6 are all about when disaster strikes. And they are all about what it means to be a strong building which stays firm during disaster. Jesus' story is the story of the so-called wise and foolish builders. Most will know it, I think, but what struck me when preparing this talk is that both types of people Jesus describes are builders. And that means that from the outside, it looks like both types of people have done very well in building a home for themselves. Well done, both. But actually, no, it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all. This passage is about two kinds of people who call Jesus Lord. He divides them into two categories. Those who call him Lord, hear his voice and obey him, they are good builders. And those who call him Lord, hear his voice and don't obey him, they are bad builders. And these two simple options of bad building and good building might challenge us a bit, because Jesus tells us here that the person who says they're a Christian but doesn't show it by their life is really not in a good place. We might be tempted to think like, oh, all they need is shoving in the microwave for 30 seconds. They're already there, they just need warming up a bit. But Jesus tells us that more than just a bit of encouragement is needed, because where they currently are is building for destruction. There may be a feeling of security in saying we believe in Jesus, whilst actually going about basing our life on money, reputation, career, thrill-seeking, security, or even upon family. There may be that sense that you could say, I've worked hard to get my life into a place where everything is secure and it's all looking good. And whilst I leave God out of all of that, I am happy to say I believe in Jesus, so he's got my back as well. It's like having a double security. But Jesus says that situation is not actually a double security at all. Instead, it is heading for disaster, whether in this life or in the next. A building like that might look okay from the outside, but actually it's headed for disaster. There's no foundation. It's totally vulnerable. When the challenges of this life hit that building, the whole thing crashes to the ground. And the point Jesus makes generally about how we build for life, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 makes about the work of church ministry. That is the work of any Christian involved in ministry. He tells us that the only foundation anyone can build on is Jesus. And my guess is pretty much any church would agree with that. And yet he goes on to say that simply building on that foundation is not enough, because it's possible to build on that foundation with stuff that is no good for building. Look at the list of building materials he lists. They range from gold to straw, something strong and beautiful, all the way to something thin and weak and vulnerable. It's easy for any individual or church congregation to say, we're doing this to serve Jesus, and think that gives them God's complete seal of approval. But Paul shows us that the question, what are you doing for Jesus and what are you building with, is absolutely valid. Because just like the builders Jesus spoke of in Luke 6, one day the quality of our ministry will be revealed for what it really is. I could preach beautiful, poetic sermons that sound lovely and have all sorts of clever ideas and words in them, and I could say I'm doing it for Jesus and his gospel. But if they're not based in a true, prayerful, dependent, obedient relationship with him, then on the day of Jesus' return, they could be revealed as built with hay or straw, and so burnt up and shown all along to have been worthless. A church could build an amazing new building with all kinds of stuff built into it. That will amaze visitors, and they could say they were doing it for Jesus and his gospel. But if it's not built for the right reasons, then such an effort might be shown up as hay or straw on the day of Jesus' return and burnt up and shown to be worthless. Someone could get 100 people to start coming along to church with them, and the building would look full. Woohoo! Or is it woohoo? Because if those people come to church but never come to understand what the gospel of Jesus Christ is and never accept it for themselves, then on the day of Jesus' return it will be a disaster for them, and that supposed success will shown to be building with hay or straw. Those involved in such burnt up ministry, Paul tells us, will be saved, but it will be as what they have worked for is destroyed around them. On the other hand, think of maybe a quiet old man who's part of your congregation, never attracts attention to himself. Well, maybe one day when Jesus returns, it will be revealed that actually he spent years and years and years in prayer, and those prayers were mightily used by God for the growth of his kingdom on earth. Maybe no one knew it, but he was building with gold or silver, really strong, material that really lasts. Or the young lady in your congregation who quietly and prayerfully encourages other Christians in all sorts of different ways. That might be shown to be building with precious stones, which will look beautiful into eternity. Therefore, the question is not whether we build or not, but it is what and how we will build. Appearances can be deceptive, and the quality of the building is not always obvious. There are ways I've felt challenged recently in life and ministry, specifically in the areas of me being persistent in asking God for good gifts, rather than just being a bit flaky and giving up. And also in the area of patience and forgiveness, and of having a right attitude in relationships. And I thank God for that, because although being challenged doesn't always feel easy, I'm confident God is leading me into building better, building stronger, so that when the day of testing comes, whether in this life or when Jesus returns, that work might stand the test. I read a really interesting post from a guy called Phil Moore yesterday online. He is a church leader in London, and he shared the story of a missionary in China called James Fraser, who was ministering in the early 20th century in an area called Lizuland in China, which was in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. And there were times when it was so snowy that he couldn't get up to some of the Chinese Christian converts who lived up in villages in the hills because of the snowfall. So, after feeling frustrated about this, he worked out that if he could have got up to each of the villages in the hills, the whole journey would have taken him 3 to 5 days. 1 or 2 to get up, 1 to gather the Christian converts together, and then another 1 or 2 to get back down. And so instead, he gave those 3 to 5 days to pray for each of those highland villages with the converts in them, which he could not physically get to. And then later, when the snow melted, he climbed up to see how the Christians in those villages were doing. Amazingly, he found that those Christian converts hadn't gone back on their faith in Jesus. They hadn't abandoned him. They had actually grown as Christians during the time James Fraser couldn't get to them. In fact, he said that those Christians in the Highlands had actually grown far more in their faith than those Christians in the lowlands that he had been able to gather and visit during the same period. There's an obvious parallel in that situation to our own at the present time, not being able to meet together physically. But whilst we can't go about doing all of our ministry programs and rotas and planning and all that sort of things, we can still do the basic things Jesus asked of us. In fact, it's sobering to think that neither Jesus nor his apostles talked about programs or rotas or plans. But they do talk about prayer. And they do talk about obedience. And they do talk about worship. And they talk about forgiving others as we have been forgiven. And they talk about pursuing holiness just as God is holy. And they talk about love of God and love of neighbour, whoever our neighbour is at this very moment. Don't believe we cannot build for the kingdom of God during this challenging time when normal life is turned upside down. In fact, this whole situation might help us get back to basics, back to Christian Building 101. So, how are we building? And the question applies to both us as individuals and our lives as Jesus shows us. And it also applies to how we go about doing ministry in the Christian community and in the world, as Paul shows us in 1 Corinthians. Will we build for the appearance of success or security in this life, or will we be obedient and through the power of the Holy Spirit build what will last into eternity? Thank you.